Hi, and welcome to today's Engaging for Missouri webinar. I'm Alice Roach from the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri, and I'll be your host today. With each of these 30-minute webinars, we intend to share research-based insights that leaders like you can apply in your own work to benefit and strengthen the state's agriculture and food system, hospitality sector, and communities. For today's webinar, Dru Buntin and Chris Klenklen will present about the 2019 Coordinated Flood Response and Resiliency for the Future. Before I invite them to present, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. First, we'll close the webinar today with a question and answer session. Those of you who connected to today's webinar via your computer can submit your questions in the chat screen. So to open that chat screen, you can just click the chat button that you see at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you joined by phone, then you can send me an email with your questions. My email address is roacham@missouri.edu. Second, all attendees are muted and may not start their video. Third, if you encounter any technical difficulties today during the webinar, then you can let me know by submitting a comment in the chat screen, or you can send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. Fourth, we will make a recorded version of the webinar available to you. You can look for an email from Zoom in about a day from now that shares more about where you can access that webinar recording. Also, you can find an archive of all of our previous Engaging for Missouri webinars on our division's YouTube page. So with that, we'll transition to the topic of today's webinar, which is titled 2019 Coordinated Flood Response, Building Resiliency for the Future. Presenting on this topic are Dru Buntin, who is the Deputy Director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, and Chris Klenklen, who is the Deputy Director of the Missouri Department of Agriculture. So thank you, Dru and Chris, for presenting today. Chris, if you could go ahead and start your video and unmute your microphone, then we can begin today's presentation.
Well, good morning, and thank you for having us today. I think it goes without saying the 2019 flood was unprecedented in a lot of ways. The flooding started earlier and lasted longer than any previous flood on the Missouri River last year. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers declared the flood for 279 days, which was much longer than the 2011 flood, which was our most recent major flood like that, or the 1993 flood, which was also a flood of record. That's on the Missouri River. On the Mississippi River was above flood stage for well over 100 days, and which was almost double the 1993 flood, which many referred to as the major flood on the Mississippi. As we transitioned, as we started the repair process, or working with the Corps of Engineers on the partnering with the Corps of Engineers on their responsibilities for the Missouri, we work with several core districts. Omaha, Kansas City has most of the responsibility for the Missouri River. The Omaha district has responsibility for the river north of Atchison County, basically, and then from the Kansas City district covers the river from Holt County to near St. Louis. We also deal with the Rock Island district on the Mississippi River, which has most of the northeast part of the state, and then also the St. Louis district. We've worked with all three of those, or all those districts to work towards getting repairs made along the levees along the river. For levees, most of the levees there's multiple different kinds of levees, but for the most part, there are federal levees, which really result mainly up in the Atchison County is the only county that has a lot of federal levees, with the exception of some of the levees around the major metropolitan areas. And those levee repairs are 100% fully funded by the Corps of Engineers. The levees that are built in most of the state are called PL 8499 levees. Those levees are repaired at a cost share of 75% federal dollars and 25% local match. During this process of repairing the levees, and this is somewhat unique this year, the state is assisting the local level levy districts with coming up with a percentage of that local match. And so that's, we'll talk about that maybe a little later. The Kansas City district has 66 levees that need to be repaired. And 24 of those they have awarded contracts on. 42 contracts are in the process of being advertised or being deployed. The St. Louis district has 8 levees that need to be repaired, 2 that are in construction, and 2 contracts are being developed, and 4 contracts are in the design phase. And then the Rock Island district in Northeast Missouri has 1 levee being repaired, and the contract for repair has been awarded. So that's the process that, I mean, this process to a certain extent happens after every major flood. I think one of the differences this year was that we've seen was Governor Parson took the initiatives to he signed an executive order in July of 2019 to form an advisory working group to kind of make some changes or to talk to the state about making, trying to figure out how we react to these floods differently in the future. So I think I'll pass that on to probably to take over from there.
Thanks, Chris. Again, I'm Dru Buntin. I'm Deputy Director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And as Chris said, the Flood Recovery Working Group has been meeting since July of last year. The group is made up of a number of different individuals. If you're interested in the meetings of the group, the members, some of the recommendations that were included in the interim report that the group submitted to Governor Parson at the end of December, you can find that information on DNR's webpage at dnr.mo.gov /flood recovery. There are videos of all of the meetings. There is supporting information, and there are summaries of all of the meetings to date. So we, as Chris said, we've got a target date of submitting the final report to Governor Parson at the end of May. And so the group has one more scheduled meeting on May 13th. These meetings are all live streamed. It's May 13th at 1 o'clock. And at that meeting, the group will be talking about some of the final recommendations that they had. The Governor Parson's executive order asked the group to look at 2 things. One of them, as Chris referenced, we tend, whether it's 1993 or 2011, there are a lot of factors that incent landowners and levee districts to get that level of protection back quickly, whether it's crop insurance or other things. There are implications to them to obviously to not having the same level of protection. So one of the things that Governor Parson charged the group at is looking at some of the most problematic areas on both the Missouri and Mississippi where we see recurring damages over and over again in these large flood events, and looking at things that we could do differently. So that was one of the charges. And as Chris also referenced, we work with a lot of different federal agencies and authorities on these. And I just want to correct one thing. The cost share on the non-federal levies is actually 80-20 instead of 75-25. And so the General Assembly this past legislative session appropriated $6 million to help with the recovery of these damages. And so one of the first things the group recommended was that that we focus on these non-federal levies that require a 20% local match. And so the state is covering, at the group's recommendation, 75% of that local 20% match for the recovery of those non-federal levies. There are a number of other recommendations that are included in the group. You know, I talked about the number of federal agencies and state agencies, whether it's State Emergency Management Agency, our two agencies, the Department of Natural Resources and Department of Agriculture. There are a lot of different programs out there, and sometimes it's hard for a landowner who sees these impacts, whether it's a breached levee or they've got drainage ditches that are filled with silt. You know, NRCS has programs available to help with that. There's assistance through FSA, a number of different agencies. And so one of the recommendations was that the state take the lead in developing a resource guide for landowners and localities to be able to go to based on the type of assistance they need, so they don't have to navigate and determine where those assistance opportunities are available. Another thing that the group indicated support for was those of you that have followed this flood event at all know that the states, whether it be on the lower Missouri River, Governor Parson and his counterparts in Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas have been meeting a number of different times. The 4 states on the lower Missouri River have signed a memorandum of agreement on how they will work together to address and implement real changes in terms of our flood protection infrastructure in those areas that we see the most recurring problems. And we have engaged in a similar effort on the Mississippi. And so the group wanted to support those efforts. In addition, in Atchison County, there is a project where the Atchison County Levee District number 1 is attempting to do a setback levee, moving their levee back off the river in an area where it has been damaged in multiple different year flood events. And so the state is attempting to support that levee setback that is in an area where the river's constricted. So not only will it reduce damages in that area in Atchison County, it will provide a benefit to the whole area. So those are just some of the recommendations. As I said, if you want to go to our webpage, you'll be able to find all of those recommendations, and I'm happy to answer any questions about those. Chris and I'd be happy to answer. So talked a little bit about the 4-state collaboration on the Missouri River. We, in addition to signing a memorandum of agreement, we have been meeting in the last number of months with our counterparts in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. We have engaged in a study agreement with the Corps of Engineers that will have the states leading a local conversation in some of the areas where we have seen the most amount of damages, the most recurring damages in particular areas. And then the states will be leading a conversation with local leaders and landowners and levee districts and others that are interested in those conversations on some of the most problematic areas on the river. In addition, we're all working with our respective congressional delegations to be able to take some of what we identify and develop consensus on changes that we want to see to our infrastructure, to be able to move quickly to be able to implement some of those solutions. So that work is ongoing. In fact, even yesterday, we had a call with those 3 states to talk about some things that are moving in Congress as it relates to the Missouri River. I should have advanced the slide before. But this just shows you some of what we're doing with the other states on the Missouri River. That also includes an update of what we call the flow frequency information on the Missouri River to determine, based on recent data and what we project going out into the future, what we should be planning for, not just looking at the period of record, but looking out based on more recent years, what we might anticipate on the lower Missouri. We're engaging in a similar process on the upper Mississippi River. And just for comparison, on both the lower Missouri and upper Mississippi River, we do not have a comprehensive plan for being able to handle these kind of large flood events. What we have is more a series of levee systems and protection infrastructure that was put together over decades with the involvement of different federal and state agencies, but we don't have a comprehensive plan on how we best manage these kinds of events to minimize damage the same way that they do on, for example, the lower Mississippi River, where they have the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, which has storage areas and which has design flow, conveyance, and things like that. And so what we're trying to move towards on the lower Missouri and the upper Mississippi is more of a comprehensive approach to how we manage these kind of events. So we are doing that through the Upper Mississippi River Basin Association, of which Missouri is a member, along with Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So Chris and I both sit on the board of that organization. They have also been out and we've participated in these local meetings to look at what do the local leaders and the folks that live, work, and farm along the river, what kind of problems are they seeing? What kind of solutions would they support to try and develop a regional approach to minimizing these types of damages? So those are some of the things that we're working on, both within the agencies in Missouri and also with our federal partners and the states in our region, in response to, as Chris covered, just the unprecedented duration of the flood event that we saw last year. That has made it very difficult to be able to go in and assess the extent of the damages. So that is another thing that's been a little different about this flood event, is that because the water stayed high for so long, it made it difficult to get in and access the areas to determine even the extent of the damages. So it will be probably a couple of year process to recover from this event. We were very concerned going into this spring that with the compromised nature of our infrastructure, with all of the breached levees and the saturated soils and all of those types of things, that we were very concerned about what we might experience this spring. Luckily, we haven't seen the kind of rainfall and inflow into the system that we saw last year. And so we're hoping that this will allow for our infrastructure to be repaired as much as possible this summer. But it's clear, I think, to all of us involved that this is going to be more than a year recovery process. And so, Alice, with that, I think Chris and I'd be happy to take any questions that folks have.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for presenting. And if you do have a question, you can go ahead and put that in the chat screen here within Zoom, or you can also send me an email at roacham@missouri.edu. To get started with our Q&A, one of the questions that I had kind of stems from that interim report that the working group released, I guess it was in December. And one of those recommendations was to assess the long-term impacts that the 2019 flood would have on agriculture. Is there any sense of what that estimate might look like? Or have you been able to get that far in the process to assess those long-term impacts?
I don't know that we have a a long-term impact yet. We know that we had a record number of acres that were impacted last year. We had a large number of acres that did not get planted in 2019. But I guess we're optimistic that this year a lot of that land is coming back into production, or has the ability to come back in production. Some of it will be determined a little bit based on when these levees get repaired. Crop insurance plays a huge role in agriculture, and so and insurance policies, the premiums on those policies are adjusted based on the risk that they require. And so if those levees are not repaired, that will have a detrimental effect on the landowner or the farmer, because they'll have to pay a higher premium to farm that land. So there will be a decision have to be reached with some of that land. Are we going to farm it this year and pay a higher premium, or do we, when the levee is not yet repaired? If the levee is repaired, they're going to go back in and farm it. But if not, I think there will be some carryover impact to agriculture this coming year. But I don't know that I can give you a dollar figure.
Sure. Another question is that one of the findings in that interim report talked about how urban flood protection has tended to be more successful than rural flood protection. And I'm wondering if you can explain the difference.
Yeah, so a lot of the level of protection that is allowed or is able to be funded, particularly when you're talking about these Corps of Engineers authorities, it looks at cost benefit. So when you look at the assets that you're protecting, that comes to bear when you consider what level of expenditure is able to be justified based on the cost benefit analysis that the Corps of Engineers has to go through. The other thing I would say is that because of the crop insurance implications that Chris mentioned, some of the things that we would like to see is the ability to modify the engineering. Not necessarily, people tend to fixate on the height of the levees, or people wanting to raise their levees, but oftentimes it has as much to do with the nature of the construction. A lot of our levees, particularly, in the agricultural areas, are sand core levees. So it's very important that you be able, if you're going to, if we're seeing river stage that's going to overtop your levee, it's very important to be able to know and control where that water comes in, so that you have the ability to divert that water in such a way that it doesn't end up with a breach. Because once you have a breach and have the force of all that water coming in very quickly, the erosion and the cost and the extent of effort that it takes to recover is much greater. And so when we've wanted to go back and look at the way in which these levees are constructed, whether it's the alignment or just the basic materials that are used, or the width, or the height in areas where you can predict, it's also much better if you have an area where you're going to overtop, that it occur in the most downstream portion of your levee, so that the water is backing in instead of coming in at the upper end of your levee, where it's going to erode out, and then you're going to have that water flowing down through your entire levee system. But when you're looking at those kind of approaches, when you've got the crop insurance implications, there's a big incentive for those landowners to get that level of protection back as quickly as possible. And some of the federal authorities have made it difficult to change the construction approach, or change anything about your approach to protection without causing a delay of time that has real implications to whether that's going to be an attractive option for those particular landowners.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question here that's clarifying, what is the meeting that is going to be taking place on May 13th at 1 p.m.? Who's meeting and what's the context for that meeting?
That is the Governor Parson, that's the Flood Recovery Advisory Working Group that Governor Parson appointed to advise the state's approach to the recovery from the 2019 flood event. So that is made up of a number of different groups. It's made up of representatives from one of the regional planning commissions, some of the commodity groups, the corn growers, soybean, the Coalition to Protect Missouri River. So it's made up of representatives of different interests along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers.
Great. Another question here asks, how will plans take into account predictions of hydroclimatic change in the Missouri River Basin?
Yeah, so I referenced the update that we have been working with the Corps of Engineers on the Missouri River. So that's an update of the flow frequency study, which looks at what we're seeing, what some of the scenarios projecting out into the future based on more recent data are looking at, so that we're not just using the period of record, but also looking at some future scenarios that would play into that question. So that update of the flow frequency is going to be important in terms of determining what we might see in the future. People hear about 100-year flood events or 500-year flood events. Obviously we're seeing an increase in the number of those multi-year flood events. And so that flow frequency study update will help us have a more accurate understanding of what intervals we're likely to see the kind of events that we saw, whether it's in 2011 or 2019.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Last year's floodwaters created some problems for shipping goods, particularly via the Missouri River. So what can be done to manage waters in a way that will support moving product via the state's waterways?
Well, the river is managed to a certain degree for that, with the reservoir systems in the upper Missouri River Basin hold a lot of water that is then used later in the year for navigation. But when too much water is coming down the river, there's not a whole lot of infrastructure in place to try to deflect that or to slow it down. So, but there are 8 authorized purposes on the Missouri River. Navigation is one of those authorized purposes, and there is a lot of water held in the northern states for that purpose, that and the other 7 purposes.
Sure.
Yeah, and what Chris references is correct. The Missouri River, unlike the Mississippi, was designed to be a self-scouring channel, navigation channel. So you see when you look at the river at certain stage, you can see the wing dikes that are there to concentrate the energy in the navigation channel so that it self-scours. One of the consequences of that, though, is when we see these large flood events, you get deposition of material, silt, sand in the navigation channel, and it can cause problems. And because the Corps of Engineers doesn't do a whole lot of dredging on the river, it can cause some shoaling in areas where it's very difficult for the navigators to get through. The Missouri River is also very narrow, and we have a lot of bends on the river, which make it challenging. I would just say that some of the areas that are problematic for the navigators are also some of the same areas that are problematic from a flood infrastructure perspective. One of those areas in the kind of Arrow Rock area, which is kind of the Lisbon Bottoms area, is a problem from a flood risk perspective and a navigation perspective. So we've been trying to get input from the navigation industry so that we can determine, as we're looking at flood infrastructure needs, that we're also considering what's called the Bank Stabilization and Navigation Project infrastructure, so that if we can come up with projects in a particular area that can address both navigation needs and flood protection needs, that's what we're going to attempt to do.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for joining us today for today's webinar presentation, and thank you to our audience too. When you exit Zoom, you'll see a post-webinar survey will load in your browser. Please consider responding, as we'll use the results to improve the webinar experience and also brainstorm future webinar topics. Again, you should receive a recorded copy of today's webinar via your email within about a day from now. So next week, we'll have 2 Engaging for Missouri webinars. On Wednesday, Dr. Sarah Lowe, who's the Associate Professor of Regional Economics and the Director of MU Extension's Exceed program, will share results of research about farmers using online marketing to market foods directly to consumers. So later today, you can look for an email that shares registration information for next week's webinars. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you.
And thanks again to Chris and Drew.
Thank you.
Thanks.